If Inspector Purbright had been asked to describe the ideal way to spend a quiet Saturday afternoon, he might have said something vague about tending to his modest vegetables or reading the more innocent sections of the Times. He would not, under any circumstances, have mentioned a guided heritage tour. Yet here he was, standing in the long oak corridor of Frost Manor, a newly refurbished, aggressively advertised country treasure experience, because his wife had said, quite firmly, "It will be good for you, dear." The manor smelled of fresh varnish, polished hopes, and the faintly medicinal tang of new tourism brochures. A dozen residents of Flaxborough shuffled about with varying levels of enthusiasm, while the newly installed curator, Mr. Owen Latchbury, fussed like a man trying to keep history from escaping through the walls. The tour had been going smoothly, if not thrillingly. Latchbury delivered his lines with theatrical solemnity. "And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the cabinet of the Manor's lost cartographies." Purbright found the title unnecessarily mystical, but he supposed brochures were written by people who needed excitement more than accuracy. The cabinet was tall, walnut, and fitted with a brass lock that appeared determined to project the idea of security. The curator patted it fondly, the way a nervous lecturer touches a chalkboard for reassurance. He cleared his throat. "And inside this we keep the late 18th century vellum map of the Flaxborough waterworks, a rare artifact showing the original underground flow lines, and now worth, several £1,000s. A ripple passed through the group. Flaxborough citizens could be stirred by two things: full patterns, and the valuation of anything belonging to their town. Latchbury inserted a key, turned it with a ceremonious flourish, and tugged the door open. Then he froze. "Oh," he said. "Oh dear, that's odd." The cabinet was empty. A hush fell over the corridor, so complete that Purbright could hear the distant ticking of a grandfather clock, or perhaps his own sense of leisure evaporating. Mrs. Teatwell, a woman whose life's joy was discovering calamity, clutched her handbag. "Good heavens, it's been stolen!" Her delight was only marginally concealed. A stout man in a mustard mackintosh, identified during the brochure queue as Mr. Bolton of the hardware shop, grunted. "Typical. You open a manor and thieves come sniffing." Another visitor, tall, angular, and wearing an expression of permanent irritation, merely folded his arms. "Well, that's a bother," he muttered, though with a tone suggesting the universe had personally wronged him. Purbright glanced at him. It was the kind of annoyance one might expect from a man whose bus was 5 minutes late, not from someone witnessing a historical loss. Latchbury, meanwhile, fluttered like an anxious hen. "I locked it last night. Absolutely locked." "The key hasn't left my possession." Someone muttered that perhaps the lock was faulty. The curator reacted with more offence than seemed necessary. "Faulty? I'll have you know this cabinet was restored by artisans." The manor's new owner, a cheerful, loudly dressed woman named Mrs. Lyons, hurried over, her bangles clinking like distant wind chimes. "Is something the matter?" Latchbury made a gesture somewhere between despair and accusation. "The map, it's gone." Mrs. Lyons looked truly distressed. She had been telling anyone who would listen that Frost Manor was her passion project, and that she intended to turn it into the cultural jewel of the region. Purbright, stepping closer, examined the lock. It bore no scratches. The mechanism appeared intact. He could not, of course, announce anything dramatic. It was neither his style nor his profession at that particular moment, but he noted that nothing about the cabinet suggested forced entry. "It could have been misplaced," said Mrs. Lyons hopefully, though her voice trembled with the same optimism as a cake balancing on a windowsill. Mr. Bolton laughed. "Misplaced? A whole vellum map? What did it do? Walk off?" The irritated man exhaled sharply. Can we move on? Some of us didn't come here for melodrama. This earned him several sharp looks. Flaxborough folk believed in the respectable display of concern during public mishaps. Latchbury pressed both hands to his forehead. I must check the other rooms. Perhaps. But he got no further, because Mrs. Teatwell had already drawn a dramatic inhale. There's no need to search, Mr. Latchbury, she declared. We all know what this is. Everyone turned. A poltergeist, she said, with grim satisfaction. A literate one. Mrs. Lyons blanched. Oh, please, not ghosts again. The estate agent promised me this place had absolutely no... Purbright gently stepped forward. Perhaps, he suggested, we allow Mr. Latchbury a moment to gather his thoughts. His tone, calm and polite, dispersed some of the panic. People shifted, muttered, and pretended not to enjoy the excitement quite as much as they did. Only the irritated man remained visibly displeased, not anxious, but vexed, like someone whose schedule had been inconvenienced. Purbright stored that away. Mrs. Lyons, recovering her brightness, said, I think we'll cut the tour short, everyone. Tea and buns are available in the parlour. Please do help yourselves while we sort this little hiccup. The crowd, reassured by the universal remedy of baked goods, shuffled away. Purbright stayed behind a moment, studying the empty cabinet. The brass gleamed. The air smelled faintly of lavender or something floral. The lock was unblemished. The curator was near tears. A simple missing artifact, perhaps, but Purbright had long learned that in Flaxborough, simplicity was a rare and usually deceptive visitor. He watched the irritated man depart the corridor, shoulders stiff. There, Purbright thought mildly, went a man whose annoyance had far too sharp an edge. By the following morning, Flaxborough had already taken the missing vellum map and transformed it into something far grander than the truth dared to be. The town possessed an admirable efficiency when it came to the relay of rumour. One whisper in the market square could become a confident declaration in the library within the hour, and so, while Inspector Purbright sat at his small kitchen table, finishing a modest breakfast, the rest of Flaxborough had taken it upon themselves to reconstruct the theft with enthusiastic inaccuracy. At the High Street tea shop, Mrs. Teatwell was already on her second pot of Earl Grey and her third retelling of events. Each retelling grew in dramatic flourish. It was terribly sinister, she informed a captivated crowd. The cabinet door opened all by itself, quite on its own, and the map vanished into thin air, a supernatural occurrence, if ever there was one. Her audience, most of whom had never encountered a supernatural event, but enjoyed the idea immensely, nodded in solemn fascination. One woman gasped and pressed a hand to her chest. "But the police were there, weren't they?" asked another. "Surely Inspector Purbright doesn't believe in such things?" Mrs. Teatwell adopted a knowing expression. "He said nothing," which of course tells one everything. Across town at the library, Miss Pomeroy, who prided herself on calmness and rationality, or at least the performance of it, informed a group of patrons that a priceless medieval manuscript had been stolen. She had deduced this based on the simple reasoning that anything worth stealing must be a manuscript, preferably illuminated. Meanwhile, Councillor Cropper, who had heard only half of the gossip but intended to leverage it entirely, stood in the council office declaiming that Frost Manor had become a magnet for criminal elements. According to him, the stolen item was either a collection of antique coins or possibly a ceremonial dagger. His audience did not protest the inconsistency. It was not considered polite to question a councillor's creativity. Purbright, for his part, arrived at the police station to find Sergeant Malley already deep in the swirling fog of misinformation. Papers were strewn across Malley's desk, most containing scribbled notes of dubious accuracy. "Morning, sir," Mally said, rubbing his temples. "We've had 4 calls already about the, theft. None of them agree on what's missing." Purbright placed his hat on the peg. "Indeed? What are the current favourites? A crown jewel, a prehistoric map, a cursed letter, and one woman insisted the culprit was invisible." Purbright showed no outward reaction to this. "Well, that should narrow things down." Mally exhaled. "There's talk we ought to question the groundskeeper. Councillor Cropper came in earlier, said the man is a likely candidate because of the, incident with the museum souvenirs." Purbright recalled the groundskeeper, a mild, absent-minded fellow named Subtle, whose greatest crime had been borrowing an antique lantern without permission because he wanted to see what Victorian light felt like. It was not behaviour that indicated a penchant for high-stakes cartographic theft. "Has Subtle been in this morning?" Purbright asked. "No, sir. He's on shift at the manor." Purbright nodded. "We'll speak with him soon enough." But he had someone else lingering more prominently in his thoughts, the tall, angular man with the curiously irritated response to the cabinet's emptiness. A reaction not of surprise nor alarm, but inconvenience. He left the station and walked toward the market square, letting his thoughts settle naturally. The morning was crisp, the air damp enough to soften the edges of sound. A few shopkeepers were sweeping their doorsteps with the solemnity of men performing ancient rituals. He passed the hardware shop, where Mr. Bolton stood outside discussing, loudly, the need for better locks. Bolton noticed Purbright straightened his posture and announced, "Morning, Inspector. Heard they've lost some kind of precious artifact up at that manor. I'd be happy to recommend some security fittings." Purbright smiled mildly. "Your generosity is admirable, Mr. Bolton. Let us hope the manor's troubles do not require an overhaul of hinges just yet." "Still," Bolton continued, lowering his voice, "you'll want to keep an eye on outsiders. They come in, they poke around, they leave with something valuable. Mark my words." "Thank you," Purbright said. "Your words are indeed marked." He moved on, letting the bustle of the square wash around him. Flaxborough was a town of steady routines, small rivalries, and quietly held opinions. People rarely acted without reason, though the reasons were sometimes hidden even from themselves. At the far end of the square near the bookshop, he spotted a familiar posture, the tall, irritated visitor from the previous day, wearing the same stiff expression as though the world had not yet apologized for existing. The man noticed Purbright and hesitated, only a fraction, but enough to interest the inspector. "Good morning," Purbright said, his tone friendly. "I believe you were present yesterday at the Frost Manor tour?" The man nodded curtly. "Unfortunate business. I trust you'll sort it out quickly." Purbright examined him without appearing to. "If we are fortunate. I hope the experience did not greatly inconvenience you." "It was merely a waste of time," the man replied. "I had hoped to see the estate properly, not be subjected to theatrics." Purbright tilted his head. "The missing map struck you as theatrics?" "It struck me as poor management." The man seemed to realize the sharpness of his tone and softened it a fraction. "I'm simply saying the curator should have better control over his displays." "Quite," Purbright agreed gently. "May I ask your name?" "Harold Fenwick." "Are you visiting Flaxborough long, Mr. Fenwick?" "Just a few days. Business." "Ah," Purbright murmured. "And you have no particular interest in historical cartography?" Fenwick blinked, a subtle tightening at the mouth. "No, none at all." "Very good," Purbright said pleasantly. "Enjoy your stay." Fenwick left with a briskness bordering on retreat. Purbright stood a moment, turning over the exchange in his mind. People who wished to appear unconnected often overdid the performance, offering explanations before they were asked, or adopting a tone too firm in its indifference. Fenwick had done precisely that, but suspicion was only a beginning, not a conclusion. The gossip, the embellishments, the leaps to blame, all these formed the familiar early currents of a case. Yet beneath them, Purbright sensed a quieter pattern, subtle as the floral trace he had noticed on the empty cabinet. Something at Frost Manor had disturbed more than just the town's appetite for chatter. Something, or someone, had been waiting for that map. He turned back toward the station, his gait unhurried, his thoughts orderly. The day was still young, and Flaxborough, obligingly, was already full of clues. Inspector Purbright returned to Frost Manor shortly after midday, the sky a calm, pewter grey that suggested the possibility of rain without the commitment. The gravel drive crackled beneath his shoes as he approached the front steps, where Mrs. Lyon stood issuing instructions to a pair of tradesmen about curtain rods. Her outfit, a spirited ensemble of turquoise and gold, shimmered against the subdued landscape like optimism refusing to be discouraged. She brightened further when she saw him. "Oh, Inspector, thank heavens, do come in. I haven't slept a wink over that dreadful business with the missing map." Purbright doubted the full sincerity of this claim. She looked perfectly fresh, as though she had merely lost sleep in a decorative, fashionable way. Still, he allowed her to usher him inside. The entrance hall wore its new restoration proudly. Polished floors, fresh paint, and the faint smell of new wealth still finding its footing. "You'll want Mr. Latchbury, I expect," she said, fluttering ahead. "Poor man has been beside himself. Says he locked the cabinet without question." "I would like to speak with him, yes," Purbright replied. "And perhaps the groundskeeper as well." Mrs. Lyons nodded with tragic solemnity, as though discussing a gravely ill relative. "Mr. Suttle is around the back pruning something. He's always pruning, very devoted to it." Before Purbright could ask anything further, Mr. Owen Latchbury materialized from a side room, his nervous energy practically audible. "Inspector, oh, it's all a nightmare. I assure you I locked that cabinet last night at precisely 6:30. I checked it twice. I always do. Part of my closing routine." Purbright gestured to a pair of chairs near a window. "Perhaps we sit, Mr. Latchbury. A few calm moments will help us both." They settled. Outside, a gardener moved past, carrying a bewildered-looking potted shrub. "You were the only one with a key?" Purbright asked. "Yes. Yes, indeed. I keep it on me always." Latchbury patted his breast pocket in demonstration. Purbright noted the gesture. The pocket flap was crisp, the button undone. "Always?" "Well, I may occasionally place it on the mantelpiece while dusting, but no one would know it's there, and I always retrieve it immediately." "Of course. And were you here after hours yesterday?" Latchbury shook his head vigorously. "No, I left promptly at 7. My wife insists on punctual dinners." "Was anyone else in the display corridor shortly before you locked the cabinet?" Latchbury paused, scrunching his face with effort. "Well, Mr. Suttle came through with a trolley of cleaning supplies, but he doesn't have access to the cabinet. And that tall fellow, the one with the scowl, he wandered about before the tour properly started, asked odd questions." "Odd questions?" "Yes. Wanted to know if the map was original. Seemed particularly interested in the water lines. Most people ask about ghosts." Latchbury leaned in, whispering the word as though afraid it might summon one. Purbright thanked him and stood. "You've been extremely helpful. I'll speak with Mr. Suttle, and then perhaps disturb the dust in other corners." Outside, Mr. Suttle, the groundskeeper, stood in a flower bed, holding pruning shears as though they were an extension of his soul. He was a wiry, distracted man with a perpetual squint as though trying to remember something important just beyond reach. "Morning, Mr. Subtle," Purbright said gently. Subtle startled, nearly clipping a rose. "Oh, Inspector, didn't see you come up. I understand you passed through the display corridor yesterday evening." Subtle frowned. "Did I?" "Oh, I suppose I did. Needed to fetch the mop. Only place it's kept where Mrs. Lyons won't see it, and decide we need a newer one." Purbright smiled faintly. "You didn't notice anything unusual about the cabinet?" "No, sir. It looked the same as always. Smug, if cabinets can look it." "Did you handle it at all?" Subtle shook his head emphatically. "Oh, no, sir. Mr. Latchbury once threatened to reorganize my tool shed for leaning a broom against it. I keep clear." His tone carried neither resentment nor defensiveness, simply the resigned humor of a man accustomed to the peculiarities of others. Purbright changed tack. "You know the visitors fairly well here?" "As well as any passing strangers," Subtle replied. "Some people ask sensible questions, others ask daft ones. Yesterday's tall fellow seemed tetchy." "In what way?" "Walked about like the place owed him something. Snapped when I told him the privy in the courtyard wasn't original. Who cares whether a privy is authentic?" Purbright thanked him and headed back inside, aware that he'd found nothing concrete but several threads worth holding on to. Latchbury's pocket, the irritated man's interest in the map, the unscratched lock, the faint floral scent. Mrs. Lyons intercepted him in the hall once more. "Inspector, do you think this frightful business will affect tourism? We've only just opened." "Tourism tends to thrive on mishaps," Purbright said mildly, "so long as no one is injured." She sighed in a melodramatic arc. "Well, I suppose scandal is a kind of publicity." "Quite. May I see the room again?" She led him to the corridor. Sunlight slanted across the polished floorboards, illuminating the glass case that had once housed the map. Purbright examined it again. The faint floral trace remained, a residue so delicate it seemed part of the air itself. He leaned closer and breathed in. Not lavender, after all. Something sharper, more perfumed, likely cologne. A man's scent. "Was anyone wearing anything particularly fragrant yesterday?" he asked. Mrs. Lyons shook her head. "Not that I recall. Oh, that tall man. He smelled like one of those expensive aftershaves from London. The kind that comes in a box shaped like a diamond." Purbright made no comment, but the detail slid neatly into the growing pattern. He thanked her and stepped outside, where the breeze carried the distant scent of cut grass and the faintest whisper of rain. The manor's facade loomed behind him, elegant, restored, and thoroughly unsettled by its new role as crime scene. On the path toward the village, Purbright walked at an unhurried pace, replaying the conversations in calm order. Latchbury's nervous insistence, Suttle's absent-minded honesty, Fenwick's guarded irritation. 3 personalities, 3 distinct reactions, each revealing something small but potentially significant. And hovering above them all, the missing map. Not a priceless treasure, but something someone had wanted enough to take quietly, efficiently, and without panic. Something that perhaps did more than show waterlines. When Purbright reached the road leading back toward the station, he paused, noticing fresh footprints in the soft verge, heavy, deliberate, angled toward the manor and away again. Too large to be Mrs. Lyons, too deep for the curator, too even for the meandering Subtle. Someone had doubled back after leaving. Purbright examined them a moment longer, hands clasped behind him, then resumed his walk with the air of a man who had just encountered a new verse in an old poem, quietly familiar, quietly revealing. The day was closing in grey and cool, but the case was warming noticeably. Fenwick, Subtle, Latchbury, Each would require another conversation, quiet, polite, unhurried. He moved on, the manner shrinking behind him, but the puzzle growing sharper with every step. Councillor Cropper arrived at the police station in the manner of a man who believed the world would be improved considerably if only everyone else shared his opinions. He strode into Sergeant Malley's office without knocking, waving a rolled-up newspaper like a proclamation. "There you are, Malley. This whole Frost Manor business is getting out of hand. I've had 3 constituents in my office this morning insisting the town's reputation is at stake. We must act swiftly, decisively, publicly." Purbright, who had entered only moments earlier, removed his hat and placed it on its peg, watching Cropper with the patient detachment normally reserved for meteorological forecasts and committee minutes. "What form of decisiveness do you propose?" he asked mildly. Cropper turned as though surprised the inspector had materialized. "Ah, Purbright, excellent. I was just saying we must identify the culprit with reasonable haste." "I agree haste is useful," Purbright said. "Accuracy, however, is occasionally more so." Cropper waved this off. "Accuracy will follow naturally once the proper suspect is secured. Now, I've been giving the matter careful thought, very careful, and I believe the evidence points rather firmly in one direction." "I see," Purbright murmured. "And which direction is that?" "The groundskeeper, of course, subtle. A man with a known history of, shall we say, inappropriate intimacy with museum property. Once a borrower, always a borrower." Sergeant Malley looked helplessly at Purbright, who maintained a serene expression. "Subtle was fined," Cropper went on, "for walking off with that lantern from the civic display. Claims he only wanted to experience Victorian lighting. Nonsense. Stealing is stealing." Purbright folded his hands behind him. "A lantern and a rare vellum map do occupy rather different positions on the spectrum of desirability." "Criminal intent is criminal intent," Cropper insisted. "Motivation hardly matters in the eyes of the public. They want closure." "Closure based on convenience can be misleading," Purbright replied with gentle firmness. Cropper blinked at him as if trying to interpret a foreign dialect. "Surely you don't mean to say you're excluding Subtle? He had access, he was in the corridor, and he's odd." "I find many people odd," Purbright said. "It rarely correlates with guilt." Cropper frowned and seemed about to argue further when a constable entered with a slip of paper. "Report from Frost Manor, sir," he said to Purbright. "Mrs. Lyons called. She's discovered something she believes you ought to see." Purbright accepted the note. Cropper angled, forward, eager. "Proof, no doubt." Purbright offered a polite non-committal sound, put his hat back on and excused himself. Outside, the streets of Flaxborough had settled into their afternoon pace, steady, predictable, and filled with the small, purposeful movements of a town that liked to know exactly where everything belonged. Unfortunately for them, the vellum map did not. And the more the town tried to place blame, the further the truth seemed to drift. The drive to Frost Manor was quiet, save for the turning of leaves in the hedgerows. When Purbright arrived, Mrs. Lyons was waiting on the front steps, a mixture of agitation and theatrical despair animating her features. "Oh, Inspector, thank goodness!" she exclaimed. "Owen found something dreadful while polishing the display case. I didn't want to touch it. Terribly unnerving." She swept him inside with the urgency of someone ushering a surgeon to a critical patient. The display corridor looked as it had before, polished, still, faintly perfumed by the floral trace Purbright had already noticed. Mr. Latchbury stood beside the empty cabinet, wringing his hands. "There," he said, pointing to the baseboard near the skirting. "I found that tucked beneath the wainscot." Purbright crouched, retrieving a small folded scrap of thin paper, a torn corner, really, browned with age and edged with soot. Faint lines danced across it, water channels, hand-drawn and familiar. "A fragment of the map," Purbright said. Mrs. Lyons let out a strangled gasp. "Then the thief destroyed it. Oh, Inspector, we must recover what we can." "Not necessarily destroyed," Purbright replied. "It may simply have torn during removal, or perhaps someone handled it without much care." He studied the edges closely. The burn pattern was old, older than the manor's recent restoration. This piece had not met fire last night or even last week, yet someone had seen fit to wedge it here recently. Mr. Latchbury hovered anxiously. "Does this help us identify the culprit?" "It tells us," Purbright said calmly, "that someone wants us to believe the map suffered damage at the moment it went missing." The curator swallowed hard. "And is that good?" "It depends on who benefits from such a belief," Purbright answered. He examined the wainscot closely. The dust along the lower trim was disturbed in a narrow streak. A recent disturbance, smooth and angled, as though a finger had slid something underneath. A planted clue, then, or perhaps a message. Purbright stood. "May I speak with you both separately?" Mrs. Lyons nodded vigorously. "Of course, Inspector. Anything to help." He began with Latchbury in the parlour, the curator perched on the edge of a chair, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. "Has any work been done in the corridor recently?" Purbright asked. "Carpentry? Repairs? Repainting?" "Oh no, Inspector. That wing was restored months ago. Everything there should be pristine." "And you noticed nothing amiss when you locked the cabinet last night?" "Nothing at all." Purbright let the silence stretch. Latchbury fidgeted. "You've mentioned you sometimes set your keys aside while working," Purbright said. "Might anyone have observed that habit?" Latchbury flushed. "I suppose. Perhaps. But I'm very careful. Careful enough that someone might not notice inconsistency," Purbright murmured. "Some days the pocket, some days the mantle." Latchbury stammered. "Only briefly." Purbright nodded. "You're sure nothing else is missing?" Latchbury hesitated. "I haven't checked everything yet." "Please do so," Purbright said gently, "and inform me immediately if anything seems out of place." Next he sought Mrs. Lyons, who hovered in her sitting room surrounded by velvet cushions. "Mrs. Lyons, you've been open about wanting Frost Manor to thrive as an attraction," he began. "Indeed, it's been my dream project." "Dreams can create pressure," Purbright said mildly. "Publicity, even unfortunate publicity, can attract attention." Her eyes widened. "Inspector, you can't think I would orchestrate this." "I think," Purbright replied softly, "that desperate people sometimes encourage drama. I make no accusations." Her indignation softened into flustered worry. "I only want the manor to succeed, nothing more." "I understand." He left her unsettled but not panicked. She had performed outrage competently, but lacked the sharpness required for deception. As Purbright stepped outside, Subtle approached from the side garden carrying an armload of cut branches. "Inspector, Councillor Cropper came sniffing around earlier, asked if I knew anything about stolen maps, said I looked shifty." Purbright regarded him kindly. "You needn't worry about Councillor Cropper's assessments. His judgment is enthusiastic." Subtle sighed. "I didn't steal anything, sir. I swear it." "I know," Purbright said simply. Subtle blinked. "You do?" Purbright smiled faintly. "You prune roses with more care than our thief handled a centuries-old document." As Subtle trudged on, visibly relieved, Purbright turned his gaze back toward the manor's upper windows. One of them glinted oddly, as though someone had just moved behind it and stepped away. Convenient suspects were rarely the correct ones, and everyone here, Lyons, Latchbury, Subtle, had now been fitted neatly into their expected roles by the gossiping machinery of Flaxborough, which meant, of course, that the truth almost certainly lay elsewhere. Fenwick's name tugged quietly at his thoughts. Purbright descended the steps with the calm certainty of a man who had just ruled out the obvious path, and in doing so found the next one waiting. Inspector Purbright did not return directly to the station. Instead, he walked the long gravel curve of Frost Manor's Drive until he reached the quiet lane bordering the estate. The air held the clean chill of an afternoon that couldn't decide whether to rain or simply threaten it. Birds rustled in the hedges, unsettled in the way creatures become when human affairs disturb a landscape too thoroughly. He paused by the verge where he had earlier seen the footprints. They remained clear, deep, deliberate impressions, the hallmark of someone walking with purpose rather than leisure. He knelt, studying them again. The spacing was consistent, the stride measured, not the uneven wandering of Suttle's gait, nor the shallow, hesitant steps of Latchbury. Someone confident, perhaps taller, perhaps in a hurry during departure. Fenwick's face drifted unbidden through his thoughts. But footprints alone proved nothing. Purbright rose, brushing off his hands, and turned back toward the manor. The floral scent near the display cabinet lingered in his mind. Too refined to belong to Suttle, too assertive for Latchbury, and much too modern for the dusty cabinet itself. He had smelled it before, faintly, when Fenwick passed him in the square. Such a detail, seemingly insignificant, often lived at the heart of more important truths. Inside the manor, the corridors had quieted. The bustle of tradesmen had retreated outdoors, leaving behind only the faint echo of distant hammering. Purbright returned to the display cabinet once more, allowing the stillness to settle. He examined the lock again, noting the pristine brass around the keyhole. If the cabinet had been forced, even by a careful thief, there would have been some sign, a scratch, a rough edge, a misalignment in the mechanism. But the lock sat untouched, perfectly smooth. He turned his attention to the glass case the map had once rested in. It remained empty, its clarity disrupted only by the faint, diagonal smear he had observed before. A cologne, floral yet sharp, left by someone leaning or reaching over. Fenwick had stood close during the tour. Purbright remembered the slight tilt of his shoulders as he inspected the room, the impatience in his movements. Still nothing yet formed a straight line. Not enough for certainty. He left the corridor and followed the sound of low voices to the rear of the manor where a temporary table had been set up. On it lay assorted refreshments, the remains of Mrs. Lyons's idea of hospitality. 2 volunteers from the Flaxborough Heritage Association discussed the theft in tones appropriate for church scandal. "Latchbury says the map might have been damaged," one whispered, clutching a half-eaten scone. "Imagine the tragedy." "Tragedy?" the other scoffed. "I heard the thing was barely more than an old blueprint. Perhaps the thief wanted firewood." Purbright stepped past them with a polite nod. He had no interest in amateur theories, though they did have a talent for revealing what people feared most. And fear, he knew, often pointed more reliably than logic. He found Suttle again at the greenhouse. The man seemed calmer now, reassured by their earlier conversation, pruning an unruly vine with quiet concentration. "Mr. Suttle," Purbright called softly. Suttle looked up, blinking at the sudden shift from plant life to police presence. "Back again, sir?" "Just one more question. Did you notice anything unusual in the days before the tour? Strange visitors, vehicles, deliveries?" Suttle scratched his chin. "Well, there was a parcel arrived Thursday morning, addressed to Mr. Latchbury, but he said he hadn't ordered anything. Box was empty when he opened it. Thought it was a prank." "Did he keep the box?" "Think he tossed it in the refuse bins near the service entrance." Purbright thanked him and made his way there. The bins emitted the damp, earthy scent of recently discarded renovation materials. He lifted the lid of one. Inside lay scraps of packaging paper, and wedged near the bottom, a flattened cardboard box bearing no return address. He pulled it free. One side had a faint scent clinging to it, the same floral note he had detected in the corridor. There again, that trivial detail. Someone had handled both the box and the cabinet. Someone who wanted the box to appear meaningless. Someone who assumed no one would notice a scent meant to impress, not incriminate. Purbright folded the cardboard and tucked it under his arm. Such an item might yet have value. He returned to the main hall, where Mrs. Lyons intercepted him once more, her expression anxious. "Inspector, forgive me. I keep remembering things that may or may not be relevant. It's all terribly overwhelming." Purbright smiled sympathetically. "Overwhelming events have a way of rearranging our priorities." "Well," she said, twisting a bracelet, "I recalled that yesterday morning, before the tour began. That irritable gentleman, Mr. Fenwick, arrived very early, earlier than guests usually do. He said he wanted to stroll the grounds alone. I found that peculiar." "Did he mention why?" Purbright asked. "He claimed he liked to absorb historical ambience, but he didn't strike me as the ambience type." Purbright inclined his head. "Thank you. That may be useful." Mrs. Lyons sighed, visibly relieved to be part of the solution rather than a potential problem. When Purbright stepped outside once more, the sky had grown darker, threatening rain with a quiet determination. He walked down the drive slowly, letting his thoughts settle like sediment in still water. The trivial detail, the floral cologne, now appeared in 3 places: the cabinet, the glass case, and the empty parcel box. A pattern, small but insistent. Someone had been closer to that cabinet than they pretended, closer to the curator's mail, and early enough at the manor to slip unnoticed. Fenwick had shown irritation at the theft rather than surprise. He had arrived early. He wore heavy cologne. He had asked pointed questions about the authenticity of the map. He had walked the square with the unease of someone waiting for news rather than reacting to it. Yet Purbright felt a tug of caution. People often behaved poorly when inconvenienced. It did not make them criminals. Still, trivial details rarely lied. He reached the village road once more. No automobiles passed. The world seemed briefly suspended, holding its breath. Purbright was not a man given to leaps of intuition, but he knew when the edges of a puzzle began aligning themselves. Someone was trying to obscure something far older than a simple theft. A torn fragment, a planted clue, an unnecessary scent. These were the crumbs of a plan executed with haste, not confidence. He adjusted his hat against the first hint of rain and began walking back toward town. The investigation was gaining shape. The trivial detail had declared itself, and Purbright suspected it would soon open the way to something much less trivial indeed. Inspector Purbright arrived back at Frost Manor the next morning with the same unhurried gait he brought to most investigations, though his thoughts moved rather more briskly than his steps suggested. Low clouds hung over the estate like heavy drapery, softening the edges of the roofline and the tops of the chimneys. The building seemed thoughtful, almost brooding, as though aware that its secrets were beginning to stir. Mrs. Lyons greeted him on the front steps, wrapped in a shawl, colourful enough to defy the grey sky. She looked flustered, hopeful, and tired in the way only anxious hosts could be. "Oh, Inspector, I'm so glad you're here," she said. "Owen told me you wanted to see some of the older rooms, ones we haven't quite sorted yet." Purbright nodded. "Yes, I understand there are parts of the manor not yet fully opened or catalogued." She clasped her hands. "There are a few. The restoration teams have been busy with the ground floor and the grand rooms, but some of the older spaces upstairs are still untouched. Dust, boxes, old trunks, all rather dreadful looking. You'll want to wear gloves." Purbright smiled faintly. "Clutter rarely frightens me." Mrs. Lyons led him inside, across the hall, and up the sweeping staircase. The air grew cooler with each step, as though the house resented the intrusion into its less refined corners. She paused on the first landing and turned down a narrower corridor lined with faded wallpaper, a place untouched by modern enthusiasm. "These rooms are part of the original structure," she said. "They belonged to the manor's early owners, the Frost family. The restoration team hasn't got round to them yet. My husband said they were character building. Personally, I think they're drafty." She stopped at a heavy door whose brass handle was tarnished from decades of disuse. "Here," she said, "this one hasn't been opened in ages. The key should still be in the lock." Indeed it was. Purbright turned it, feeling the stiff resistance of metal unused to movement, and pushed open the door. Cold air sighed into the corridor. The room beyond was dim, the only light filtering through a narrow window clouded with dust. A large chest sat in the centre, surrounded by fragile stacks of letters, papers, and brittle cloth. Cobwebs clung to the corners like forgotten thoughts. Purbright stepped inside slowly, careful not to disturb the delicate order of disarray. Mrs. Lyons lingered by the threshold. "We were told the previous owners left some personal effects behind. Old correspondence, household ledgers, that sort of thing. Nothing valuable, at least nothing we knew of." Purbright bent beside a small table where loose sheets lay scattered. The ink on them was faded but legible. He held one up to the light. It was a letter dating back nearly 70 years. The handwriting was elegant, looping across the page in a measured hand. "What do you make of it, Inspector?" Mrs. Lyons asked. "I'll need a moment to read," he said gently. She retreated to the corridor with visible relief. Purbright read, "The dispute cannot continue, Henry. If we are discovered altering the boundary lines, the Council will have grounds for action. You must destroy the copies of the watercourse map before they reach the registrar." The signature was smudged, but the meaning was unmistakable. Boundary lines, watercourses, the map now missing from the cabinet below. He lifted another sheet. This one mentioned adjusted lines, temporary measures, and quiet arrangements that would protect our interests. The Frost family had evidently meddled with official land boundaries, and the vellum map would have exposed it. He studied the letters for several minutes, assembling the narrative without allowing himself premature conclusions. If the original boundary changes had been illicit, then the map was more than a historical curiosity. It was evidence that someone might not want rediscovered. Fenwick, whose annoyance had bordered on hostility, had asked specifically about water lines. He had lingered near the cabinet, and now these letters pointed to a dispute that could have touched many families in Flaxborough, including perhaps his own. Purbright moved to the chest and opened it. Inside lay more papers, neatly bundled, along with a wooden case containing old surveying instruments. Among them was a rolled sheet tied with string. He unbound it carefully. A map. Not the stolen vellum map, but an older blueprint version, annotated in the margin with notes about diverted channels and risk of exposure. The faint floral scent he had detected downstairs did not linger here. This room carried only the cold smell of dust and sleep, meaning whoever had sneaked through the manor recently had not yet discovered these letters, or had simply chosen not to disturb them. Footsteps approached the corridor. It was Mr. Latchbury peering in with his usual nervous energy. Mrs. Lyons said you were exploring the older rooms. I hope you're finding something useful, Inspector. Purbright gestured toward the letters. Quite a few things, Mr. Latchbury. Historical, certainly. Potentially relevant. Latchbury's eyes widened. Relevant? Oh dear. Not about the missing map, I hope. Possibly about why someone might want it, Purbright said calmly. Latchbury stepped closer, fascinated despite himself. I had no idea the Frost family kept such sensitive material. Few families advertise such things. Do you think, Latchbury asked nervously, that the thief knew what they were taking? That they understood its value beyond monetary worth? Purbright folded the letters again. I think someone understood something, or feared something. Latchbury wrung his hands. It's becoming rather more complicated than I hoped. I don't do well with complicated matters. They give me indigestion. Purbright offered him a small, sympathetic smile. Complexity is rarely indigestion's fault, but I appreciate your candour. Mrs. Lyons appeared behind Latchbury. Inspector, is everything all right? Quite, Purbright replied. I'll need to borrow these letters for study. She nodded quickly. Whatever you need, if it helps resolve this dreadful situation, please take them. As they descended the stairs, Purbright felt the subtle shift that comes when a case begins to stretch beyond its initial boundaries. What had looked like a simple theft now resembled a much older story, one involving family reputation, concealed disputes, and perhaps the kind of legacy that people took great pains to protect. Outside, the air had grown heavier, the sky darker. Purbright walked a few steps from the manor door and looked up toward the windows, especially the one where he had glimpsed a movement the day before. Secrets in old houses rarely slept soundly, and now he had letters, evidence of misdeeds buried decades deep, enough motive for someone to fear the resurfacing of a map showing the original, unaltered truth. The floral scent, the planted scrap, the irritated visitor, the early arrival, the torn corner, every trivial detail was arranging itself quietly but insistently toward a far wider field of possibility. Purbright adjusted his hat, the first drops of rain touching the brim, and felt the case deepen around him like a pool growing darker at the centre. Whatever lay beneath Frost Manor's polished new veneer was beginning to stir toward the light. Inspector Purbright had barely returned the letters to the station when a call arrived from Frost Manor, urgent enough that Sergeant Malley's voice cracked slightly as he relayed it. A fire, small but deliberate, had broken out in one of the lesser-used sitting rooms. It had been extinguished quickly, but Mrs. Lyons sounded, in Malley's words, like someone who'd found a ghost in her pantry. Purbright, accustomed to emergencies delivered in varying degrees of exaggeration, took his coat and walked briskly into the damp afternoon. The rain had softened into a fine mist, drifting like breath across the rooftops. When he reached the manor, a faint smell of char still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of wet stone and agitated housekeeping. Mrs. Lyons met him at the door, wrapped again in her colourful shawl, though now it hung crookedly as if it had been put on in panic. "Inspector, you must come at once. It's dreadful, alarming, absolutely horrifying." Purbright nodded sympathetically. Most fires are. She led him down a narrow hallway that branched from the main corridor, one of the older wings that had yet to receive the full attentions of modern restoration. At the end stood a modest sitting room, its windows streaked with rain and its furniture shrouded in dusty sheets. 2 buckets of water sat on the floor, one still steaming faintly. Mr. Latchbury hovered near the hearth like a chastened schoolboy. "Inspector," he said, "I came in to retrieve a box of spare cataloguing cards. The room smelled odd, like burnt paper. When I stepped closer, I saw a small fire in the grate, but not a proper fire, More like someone trying to burn just one thing. Purbright approached the hearth. The ashes were recent, dark and clumped. He crouched, lifting a charred scrap with the tip of a pencil. The paper was old, brittle even under the soot, but not entirely consumed. What remained showed a few fragments of handwritten ink. Mrs. Lyons hovered behind him, wringing her hands. "We don't use this room. It's not even furnished. Why in the world would someone—" Purbright examined the scrap more closely. The handwriting, faint and curling at the edges, resembled that of the letters he'd found upstairs. "Mr. Latchbury," he asked quietly, "was this room locked?" "I don't think so," Latchbury murmured. "We haven't restored this part yet. Most of the rooms are simply left as they are." "Who knew that the older Frost correspondence existed upstairs?" "Only you, Mrs. Lyons, and myself," Latchbury replied. "Well, and Mr. Suttle, if he overheard anything." Purbright doubted Suttle's interest in archival intrigue. The man had difficulty remembering where he placed his pruning shears and would hardly have the foresight to destroy incriminating documents from a 70-year-old boundary dispute. He turned the scorched scrap over. The ink was too damaged to decipher, but the paper's texture matched that of the attic letters. Someone had entered this room quietly, chosen a hidden grate unlikely to draw attention, attempted to burn evidence, and left abruptly. "Who discovered the fire?" he asked. "I did," Latchbury said. "I came in just after finishing my rounds. The flame was still alive, only a little, so I fetched water at once." "No one else nearby?" "Not that I saw. The corridor was empty." Purbright rose slowly. The smell of burnt paper lingered in the room, sharp and unmistakable. A second incident. Not a theft this time, but an attempt at destruction. And destruction, Purbright knew, often signalled fear more loudly than any whispered rumour. Mrs. Lyons pressed a hand to her temple. "Inspector, I'm starting to regret ever buying this place. It's becoming a magnet for trouble." "It appears," Purbright said gently, "that the manor is not the source of the trouble, but the keeper of its memory." She blinked, uncomprehending, but nodded anyway. Purbright turned to Latchbury. "The burnt material. Did you remove anything before I arrived?" "No, I only extinguished the flames." "Very good. Please ensure the room stays locked from now on." Latchbury nodded vigorously, grateful for a clear instruction. As Purbright stepped back into the hallway, the faint scent of cologne drifted through the air. That same floral sharpness he had traced so many times now. It seemed impossible, the idea that it might linger in a draughty corridor hours after anyone had passed. Yet he knew scents behaved according to their own peculiar logic. He followed the trace to the main hall, where he nearly collided with Harold Fenwick. Fenwick stopped short, stiff as a startled heron. "Inspector." "Mr. Fenwick," Purbright said politely. "I didn't expect to see you here." Fenwick adjusted his coat. "Mrs. Lyons mentioned there had been another situation. I thought I might check if the tour was still happening tomorrow. I had hoped to complete it before leaving town." Purbright regarded him calmly. A fire broke out. "Unfortunate," Fenwick muttered. "These old houses are tinderboxes." "Indeed," Purbright said, "especially when someone introduces flame." Fenwick blinked, as though startled by the subtle implication. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing, merely observing." Fenwick swallowed, his jaw tightening. "If you'll excuse me, Inspector." He turned sharply and left the manor with such abruptness that even Mrs. Lyons raised an eyebrow. Purbright watched him go, noting again the scent he left trailing behind him. Not overpowering, but distinctive, unmistakably the same floral note found near the cabinet, on the glass case, and the parcel box. Mrs. Lyons approached tentatively. "Is Mr. Fenwick in some sort of trouble?" "Not at present," Purbright replied, "though his presence here is timely." She gave a nervous laugh. "Timely in what way?" "In the way smoke is timely when fire has begun." He left her to decipher that at her leisure. Outside, the rain had resumed in a steady patter. Purbright walked around the side of the house toward the service entrance. He paused beside the hedge, where something pale caught the corner of his eye. He knelt and retrieved a small piece of paper wedged between leaves, unburnt, slightly damp, bearing partial handwriting that matched the old frost letters. It had not blown here by accident. Someone leaving the sitting room after the hurried burning had brushed past the hedge, dislodging it. Purbright pocketed the fragment and continued slowly down the path. His thoughts arranged themselves calmly, one beside another. A visitor who arrived early. A man with a pronounced interest in water lines. A scent linking 3 separate locations. Now a fire that attempted to erase damaging history. And, most importantly, the sudden disappearance of Fenwick whenever something awkward arose. A second incident always shifted the scale. This one had done so decisively. Back on the drive, Purbright watched as Fenwick's dark figure receded down the lane, shoulders stiff, steps brisk. The man walked not like a casual visitor, but like someone hurrying to outrun a past catching up to him. Purbright adjusted his coat against the rain and began walking slowly after him, not to confront, not yet, but to consider the widening field into which the case had now opened. The theft no longer stood alone. Someone was afraid enough to burn evidence, to plant deceptive scraps, to return to the manor despite suspicion. Secrets, Purbright reflected, rarely confined themselves to a single room. They spilled, quietly and persistently, into every corridor they touched. Inspector Purbright walked back toward town with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who understood that conclusions arrived too quickly, often dissolved just as fast. Rain tapped lightly against his coat, gathering at the brim of his hat before sliding off in narrow, glistening threads. The world was grey, softened, and perhaps that gentleness made it easier for thoughts to drift in their natural order. Fenwick's retreating figure had long since disappeared around the bend in the road, but his presence lingered in the floral trace that clung stubbornly to the cabinet, the planted fragment beneath the wainscot, the burned papers in the grate. And now, in the damp scrap Purbright had found in the hedge, carried not by wind, but by haste. But suspicion, Purbright knew well, was only the first contour of truth. People behaved strangely for reasons both grand and pathetically small. A man rushing away from a crime scene might be a criminal, or simply a man late for a meal. A visitor asking pointed questions about a map might be hiding something, or might merely possess a gloomy personality sharpened by travel. Human nature rarely presented itself in straight lines. As he approached the village edge, Purbright paused beneath the overhang of a shop front to avoid a sudden burst of heavier rain. He watched the drops pelt the cobblestones in the wavering rhythm of a town impatient with weather. A passing motor car splashed through a puddle with a drama that seemed disproportionate to its tiny wheels. He considered the frost correspondence tucked safely inside his inner coat pocket. Those letters, so old, so brittle, had outlasted the people who wrote them, outlasted the scandal they referenced, outlasted the attempts to bury them under dust. Now someone feared the past enough to try burning it out of existence. Fear was always a better compass than evidence. Purbright resumed his walk, turning his attention inward. It was not the theft itself that troubled him most, nor even the fire. It was the pattern, a peculiar haste. Whoever had taken the map had acted efficiently, but not flawlessly. They had planted a torn corner in too obvious a place. They had attempted to burn correspondence in a room too accessible, too near the main hall. They had left traces of scent where a more disciplined criminal would have wiped a sleeve or worn gloves. This was not the behavior of a practiced thief. It was the behavior of someone desperate, propelled by anxiety rather than calculation. When he reached the outskirts of the square, he saw Miss Pomeroy through the library window, rearranging a stack of newspapers with missionary precision. She looked up, caught sight of him, and hurried outside beneath her umbrella. "Inspector, have you heard? Someone said the manor nearly burned down. It's all very dramatic." Fortunately, Miss Pomeroy, the fire was small and quickly extinguished. "Still," she said breathlessly, "many believe it is connected to the theft. There are whispers of sabotage, political revenge, or perhaps even a curse. Councillor Cropper is convinced the groundskeeper is behind it." Purbright managed an expression that was polite, but revealed nothing. Councillor Cropper finds the groundskeeper responsible for many civic difficulties. "Indeed," Miss Pomeroy said, her umbrella quivering in sympathy. "But people are saying Mr. Suttle was seen near the building before the fire. They say he looked troubled." "Mr. Suttle always looks troubled," Purbright replied gently. "It is his natural expression." Miss Pomeroy leaned in. "If you ask me, Inspector. And of course one wouldn't presume. But I believe this is something old returning. These country estates always keep histories tucked away like moths in a wardrobe." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes the moths find their way out." Miss Pomeroy beamed as though he had confirmed her theory. She hurried back inside before the rain worsened. Purbright continued through the square at a leisurely pace. He passed the bakery, where windows fogged with warm air from the ovens. He passed the ironmonger's shop, where Mr. Bolton was reorganizing screws with militant fervour. He passed the flower stall where Mrs. Teatwell was enthusiastically telling a customer that she had predicted a significant destructive event days before. None of them knew the truth, but each supplied a flavour of the town's emotional temperature. And that temperature told Purbright something important. The thief was not emboldened. They were cornered, not by the police, but by their own fear. Back at the station, he hung his coat neatly and placed the damp fragment from the hedge atop his desk. Sergeant Malley entered with a cup of tea, which he set down with reverence. "Thought you might need that, sir," Malley said. "Long morning?" "A long morning," Purbright agreed. "And a longer history?" Malley frowned. "History, sir?" Purbright tapped the fragment lightly. "The fire wasn't random. Someone attempted to destroy old correspondence, letters linked to boundary disputes that the Frost family would have preferred forgotten." "Oh," Malley said, the syllables stretching as understanding dawned. "Do you think someone's worried the map shows something inconvenient?" "Quite possible." "And you think the fellow from the Torm, the irritable one, might be involved?" Purbright folded his hands thoughtfully. "His behaviour fits more comfortably with guilt than innocence, yet I am not convinced he is keeping the entire truth. His reactions feel incomplete." "Incomplete?" Malley repeated. "Yes. People who hide something heavy usually sag beneath it. Fenwick is taut, defensive, irritated, but he is not bowed by guilt, only by pressure." Malley blinked. "Pressure from what?" "That," Purbright said, "is the part that remains elusive." The inspector rose and paced slowly to the window. Outside, rain streaked in long, slanted lines, thinning the view of the square into moving watercolour. The world beyond his reflection blurred, as though the edges of the case were dissolving and reforming with each drop. He thought again of the attic, the letters, the faint traces of manipulation in the boundary maps. Families preserved their reputations with stubborn determination. If the map revealed something damaging about an old surveyor's work, or an illegal diversion of water lines, The consequences might ripple through generations. Descendants often inherited guilt long after they had shed any connection to the original deed. If Fenwick's family had been involved, if his grandfather had played a role, then his irritation might not be arrogance at all, but shame carried unwillingly. Shame, Purbright knew, had peculiar ways of expressing itself. Sometimes it looked like anger. He returned to his desk, picking up the fragment again. It held one partial phrase, "cannot risk exposure." Enough to tell him that someone had feared discovery even then. Someone now feared it still. Purbright placed the fragment back into the envelope with the attic letters. The case had widened, yes, but it had also grown deeper, like water whose surface looked still until one peered below. Secrets had currents, strong ones. He sat back, folding his hands neatly, and allowed the silence of the office to settle. The rain continued its steady percussion. Somewhere outside, a motor car passed, tires hissing against wet stone. Yes, he thought, the truth was stirring. And when truth stirred, it usually did so because someone had tried much too hard to keep it asleep. Inspector Purbright decided, as he often did when a case reached its delicate midpoint, that a gentle prod could reveal far more than a direct interrogation. People under strain rarely reacted well to bluntness. Truth slipped more easily from those who believed themselves unobserved or underestimated. And so he planned, not a trap, exactly, but a moment, a test of human nature. He waited until the following afternoon, when the rain had finally exhausted itself and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the windows of the council offices. The air held the faint scent of damp paper and old polish. Purbright requested the small meeting room adjacent to the main chamber, a place seldom used except for quiet disputes about allotments or the occasional grievance regarding noise from the fishmonger's stall. He instructed Sergeant Malley to send polite invitations to 3 individuals, Mrs. Lyons, Mr. Latchbury, and Harold Fenwick. He framed the request in mild bureaucratic terms, a brief review of findings, knowing that such phrasing soothed the anxious and irritated the guilty. Fenwick arrived first. He entered the room with stiff shoulders and an expression that pretended indifference but betrayed unease. "I don't see why I need to be here," he muttered, taking a chair near the window. "I've told you everything I know." "Indeed," Purbright said pleasantly. "And your cooperation has been appreciated." Fenwick eyed him warily, as if expecting a trick concealed within the politeness. Moments later, Latchbury hurried in, clutching a notebook and looking as though he might faint at any moment. He took a seat reluctantly, smoothing his jacket in nervous strokes. Mrs. Lyons swept in last, her shawl a brighter shade than her expression. "Inspector, I hope this isn't too serious," she said breathlessly. "My husband is threatening to cancel all our upcoming tours." "Let us hope that won't be necessary," Purbright replied. They sat around the modest table, the sunlight forming a thin, angled blade across its surface. Purbright folded his hands. "Thank you all for coming. I wish to gather a few final impressions before I assemble my report. The situation at Frost Manor has been unusually layered." Fenwick shifted. "If this is another round of questioning—" "Not at all," Purbright said gently. "Only a clarification." He reached into his pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. The envelope looked harmless, worn, ordinary, lightly stained by the rain. But what it contained was not harmless at all. Inside were the attic letters and the charred scrap found near the hedge. Purbright did not open it. He simply rested his fingers atop it. "It may interest you," he said lightly. To know that certain documents have been recovered from Frost Manor. Documents that speak to the history of the estate. Some are old, others more recently tampered with. Mrs. Lyons leaned forward, breath caught in her throat. Latchbury swallowed audibly. Fenwick, however, froze, not visibly, but with a subtle tightening around the jaw, a stillness too abrupt to be natural. Purbright continued. These documents are quite revealing about the Frost family's dealings with the boundary lines and watercourses. They may require formal review by the council and, if necessary, the regional registrar. Fenwick's fingers curled against the arm of his chair. Purbright nearly smiled. Of particular interest is the fact that someone attempted to destroy some of these papers, quite recently, in a room seldom used. Latchbury made a choked noise of distress. Mrs. Lyons gasped softly. Fenwick stared at the envelope as though it might burst into flames again. Purbright tapped it once, very gently. Fortunately, paper often reveals more than people intend. Silence stretched taut as wire. Purbright then delivered the final nudge. Our forensic specialist, a fiction for the moment, has informed me that even charred documents can sometimes yield faint writing when exposed to a simple chemical wash, enough perhaps to identify authorship, or to determine what precisely someone wished to hide. Fenwick's breath caught, just a fraction, not easily noticed unless one was watching closely. Purbright was watching extremely closely. Mrs. Lyons turned to him, startled. Charred papers can be recovered. Oh, yes, Purbright said mildly. Quite often. Fenwick looked away sharply, eyes fixed on the window, jaw tense. His reaction was not that of an innocent man merely confused by police procedure, but of one who suddenly feared that his efforts had been insufficient. Latchbury, meanwhile, seemed torn between awe and indigestion. Incredible, he whispered. Science is extraordinary. Quite, Purbright said, though he had no intention of employing any such method. Human reactions, he found, were often more reliable than chemicals. Fenwick's voice finally emerged, tight, strained. Is this relevant to the theft? Because if not, I see no reason to involve me further. Purbright answered with the gentlest tone he possessed. I believe it may be relevant, Mr. Fenwick, particularly when one considers your early arrival at the manor, and your unusual interest in the watercourses, and your presence near the corridor before the tour began. Fenwick stiffened. Coincidence? Indeed, Purbright said softly. Life is full of them. Mrs. Lyons watched Fenwick with widening eyes, as though seeing a shadow she hadn't noticed before. Purbright leaned back slightly, allowing a comfortable silence to expand in the room. It was in silence, he knew, that guilty. Minds often betrayed themselves. The innocent fidgeted, the anxious fretted, but the guilty calculated. Fenwick's gaze returned to the envelope again. Purbright let the silence linger a few seconds more, then rose with a small smile. Thank you all. That will be all for now. Latchbury scrambled up with relief, nearly knocking over his notebook. Mrs. Lyons hurried out, murmuring about renovations and nerves and the state of her blood pressure. Fenwick remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the envelope as though it were a sealed confession. When he finally stood, he did so stiffly, offering Purbright only a curt nod before retreating from the room. Purbright watched him go, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way he avoided eye contact, not anger, not indignation, fear. The inspector collected the envelope, slipped it back into his pocket, and stepped into the empty hallway with the air of a man who had heard precisely the reaction he needed. People often betrayed themselves not through words, but through the silence that followed them. And Harold Fenwick's silence just now had rung louder than anything spoken aloud. Inspector Purbright did not immediately seek out Harold Fenwick after the meeting. An overly eager confrontation rarely produced clarity. People needed time to stew in their own worry, to sharpen the edge of their fear until it revealed what mere interrogation could not. And so Purbright allowed the remainder of the afternoon to pass with deliberate calm, returning to Frost Manor only once the light had softened into that gentle, ambiguous hour between day and evening. The manor's lamps glowed faintly through the mist, giving the house the illusion of being suspended between centuries. Mrs. Lyons met him at the door again, this time looking genuinely worn. "Inspector, do you have news?" she asked in a voice that for once carried no theatrical flourish. "I do," Purbright replied. "Might I trouble you for the use of your parlour? I think we should bring a few matters into the open." Her face tightened with nerves, but she nodded. "Of course. I'll fetch Owen. And Mr. Fenwick, he's still here, waiting for transportation back to his lodging." "Good," Purbright said simply. When they were all gathered in the parlour, Fenwick standing stiffly by the mantel, Latchbury hovering near an armchair like a man on the verge of fainting, Mrs. Lyons wringing her hands, Purbright took his place near the small writing desk. Outside, rain continued its light, persistent tapping at the windows, adding an almost courteous rhythm to the proceedings. Purbright began quietly. "I appreciate you all agreeing to meet once more. I believe we've reached a point where some clarity is required." Fenwick scoffed under his breath, but the sound lacked confidence. Mrs. Lyons shot him a reproachful look, which he ignored. Purbright withdrew the envelope again and placed it on the desk. The theft of the vellum map would, at first glance, appear to be an act of greed. But greed rarely concerns itself with century-old watercourse diagrams. No, the motive here lies not in monetary value, but in what the map represents. Fenwick shifted, a movement too abrupt to escape notice. Purbright continued slowly. "The letters found upstairs, untouched until recently, speak plainly of the Frost family's boundary manipulations, adjustments that would have affected the official record of land ownership and drainage rights. Such matters, once exposed, could have significant legal repercussions, even now." Latchbury looked from Purbright to Mrs. Lyons in wide-eyed confusion. "You mean the Frosts cheated, deliberately?" Mrs. Lyons pressed a hand to her cheek. "Good heavens! I had no idea." Fenwick remained rigid, staring at the envelope as though it were a ticking device. Purbright went on. "It seems the map's disappearance is connected not to the Frosts themselves, long gone, but to someone with a personal interest in keeping their actions hidden. Someone who feared that reopening old records might threaten a family's reputation or unearth a mistake that has lingered quietly in the shadows." Purbright paused, letting the words settle like dust. "Mr. Fenwick," he said gently, "your grandfather's name appears on several of the attic letters." Fenwick's breath hitched. Purbright's tone remained calm, almost kind. "He was the council surveyor at the time. It appears he assisted the Frost family in altering the boundary lines, perhaps under persuasion, perhaps under pressure. Whatever the reason, he participated. And if that became public knowledge—" Fenwick's face twitched. Shame first, then anger, then something more complex and weary. Purbright continued. "You arrived early on the day of the tour. You visited the map room before the others. You asked specific questions about the water lines. And the floral cologne you wear, distinctive, quite heavy, was present on the cabinet, the glass case, and the parcel box found in the refuse bins." Latchbury gasped softly, as if witnessing a scandalous scene on stage. "I did nothing wrong," Fenwick snapped, though his voice trembled. "I was only trying to prevent slander. My grandfather was a respected man." Purbright nodded. "And your intention, I suspect, was not malicious. But desperation can cloud judgment." Fenwick's jaw clenched. "If people found out what he did, the stain would fall on me, on my family. I couldn't allow that map to be displayed publicly." "So," Purbright said gently, "you used a duplicate key your grandfather kept, likely handed down among his belongings. You removed the map when you believed no one was watching, but it tore, didn't it? And in your haste, you ripped a small fragment you couldn't account for." Fenwick swallowed hard. "You planted it under the wainscot," Purbright went on, "to suggest damage during the theft. Then, when you found the attic letters the following afternoon, or overheard someone mention them, panic drove you to burn what you could. A hasty fire in an unused sitting room. But the chimney was too cold, the draught too slow. Latchbury arrived before you finished." Fenwick's hands curled into fists. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "No," Purbright said softly. "You meant to protect a ghost." Mrs. Lyons let out a trembling sigh, part relief, part sympathy. Fenwick's shoulders sagged as if something within him finally loosened, an invisible burden he had carried far longer than this investigation alone. "My grandfather," he said quietly, "always taught me that reputation is everything. I thought if the truth came out, Flaxborough would drag his memory through the mud. He wasn't a bad man. He made one mistake, one stupid mistake." Purbright regarded him with a calm, steady gaze. "Hiding mistakes rarely erases them, Mr. Fenwick. It only prolongs the moment they return." Fenwick closed his eyes. "Where is the map now?" Purbright asked, not accusingly, but with the tired firmness of a man finalizing a ledger. Fenwick hesitated. Then in a small voice, "In my suitcase, wrapped inside a coat." Mrs. Lyons gasped again, though now her concern was directed more toward the coat than the crime. Purbright nodded once. "Thank you. That will simplify matters." Fenwick sank into the nearest chair, defeated not by Purbright, but by the inevitability of consequence, the gentlest kind, but consequence nonetheless. Purbright allowed the room a moment of quiet. Rain continued its soft percussion against the windows, unbothered by scandal or confession. Finally, he spoke with calm finality. "Mr. Fenwick, your cooperation now will help ensure the matter is dealt with appropriately. The law recognizes distress, especially when no harm was intended." Fenwick nodded weakly. Mrs. Lyons inhaled deeply, straightening her shawl. Latchbury dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief. Purbright stood, gathering the envelope and slipping it once more into his coat. The case, though not fully closed, had reached the point where truth held firm enough to stand on its own. "Thank you all," he said gently. "What remains now is simply to tidy the paperwork." No dramatics, no raised voices, just truth settled quietly into place, exactly as Purbright preferred. Inspector Purbright left Frost Manor with the recovered vellum map tucked securely inside a brown evidence envelope, though he doubted it would remain an object of such dramatic interest much longer. Most stolen artifacts were glamorous only while lost. Once restored to their rightful place, they tended to return to the comfortable monotony expected of them. As Purbright walked the manor's gravel path, the rain finally broke apart into scattered drops, the sky easing into a pale, almost apologetic calm. Behind him, the house exhaled a quiet stillness, as though relieved to have its secrets brought into the open. He suspected Mrs. Lyons and Mr. Latchbury were already discussing how best to incorporate the recent events into future brochure material, tastefully phrased, of course, and stripped of any legally sensitive specificity. A mild scandal was a boon to tourism so long as it was properly phrased. Fenwick had remained in the parlour after Purbright's departure, slumped in a posture of exhausted acceptance. The inspector had recommended he rest before making a formal statement the next morning. There was no need for handcuffs, no need for force. The young man's defeat had been quiet, private, and complete. Fear, once it collapsed, left people drained in a way that punishment never could. The walk back to town gave Purbright ample time to let the case settle itself neatly into his thoughts. The stolen map, the attic letters, the fire in the old sitting room. They no longer whirled in fragments, but aligned themselves into a complete picture. A grandson protecting a grandfather's mistake. A hurried theft born from shame. A panicked fire meant to destroy what could not be safely buried. Human motives, Purbright reflected, were rarely grand. They were tender, vulnerable things. Shame, love, fear of ridicule, these were often stronger than greed or malice. Fenwick had acted foolishly, disastrously at times, but without cruelty. The law, Purbright believed, should know the difference. By the time he reached the village square, the drizzle had stopped entirely. The cobblestones glistened as though freshly polished. Mrs. Teatwell stood outside the flower stall, broadcasting her interpretation of events to anyone who passed close enough. "And of course, I always suspected it was about the manor's history," she was saying to a startled shopper. "Old houses attract unresolved energies, very spiritual places." Purbright suspected the energy she referred to would look suspiciously like gossip, if only it would hold still long enough to be seen. She spotted him. "Inspector, is it true the map is recovered, and that the culprit was someone of considerable standing?" Purbright gave her a polite nod, but nothing more. Details were best left unclaimed. They grew monstrous in such fertile soil. He continued past the stall, crossing the square at a leisurely pace. The bakery door swung open and the warm smell of bread drifted out to mingle with the cool, damp air. Purbright considered stopping for a bun, but resisted. Indulgence after a case always left him feeling suspiciously congratulatory. At the station, Sergeant Malley looked up from a mountain of paperwork with visible relief. "Oh, thank goodness, sir. I thought you might be stuck dealing with another fire." "No fires," Purbright said as he set the envelope on Malley's desk. "Only a young man entangled in the past." Malley blinked. "So he confessed then?" "Not formally," Purbright replied. "But substantially, he will give a proper statement tomorrow." Malley opened the envelope and examined the folded map with cautious reverence. "Hard to believe something like this caused so much trouble." "Many old things cause trouble when people attempt to hide them," Purbright said. "Will he be charged?" "That is for the magistrate to decide. I shall recommend leniency. His actions were misguided, not malicious." Malley nodded thoughtfully. "Shame can twist people, sir." Purbright gave a small, approving smile. "It can indeed." He retreated to his office, hung his coat to dry, and sat at his desk. The room, with its familiar scent of ink and dust and polished wood, welcomed him back into routine with comforting simplicity. He wrote for a few minutes, brief notes, tidy impressions, the kind of paperwork that restored order to the day. Outside the window, the clouds broke apart slowly, revealing a thread of pale gold in the sky. Evening crept over Flaxborough with its usual unhurried grace. The town resumed its rituals as though the events at Frost Manor were nothing more than a passing ripple. Shopkeepers closing shutters, children calling to one another as they ran home, a cyclist ringing a bell impatiently at a wayward pedestrian. Normality, that most loyal of companions, had returned. Later, Purbright walked across the square once more, this time without purpose except the pleasure of fresh air after a day indoors. He paused near the fountain where a thin trickle of water fell in gentle rhythm. The world felt calm again. Cases always ended this way, quietly, almost anticlimactically dissolving back into the understated fabric of Flaxborough life. He considered Fenwick again, the stiff posture, the clipped tone, the brittle pride. The young man would face public embarrassment, yes, but not ruin. Flaxborough could be unkind in its whispers, but it had an equally strong habit of forgetting scandal when the next one arrived. And it would. It always did. Purbright reached the steps of the station once more, climbed them slowly and returned inside. Mally had gone home. The corridor was empty, the building silent. He entered his office, switched off the lamp, and allowed himself a long, steady breath. Another case resolved, another secret unearthed, another reminder that the past was a patient creature, always waiting for the right moment, or the wrong one, to surface. He gathered his hat, locked the office, and stepped into the cool evening. The breeze brushed his coat as if offering a gentle nod of its own. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour with reassuring certainty. Purbright adjusted his hat and began the familiar walk home, content in the quiet satisfaction that came not from drama or applause, but from the simple return to order. Tomorrow there would be forms, statements, perhaps a brief council meeting to smooth ruffled feathers. But tonight, Flaxborough rested, and so did he.